Silent Hill 2, a game considered to be one of the greatest horror games of all time. Some would even say, the very best. Now, what would happen if that opinion was contested? What could drive a person to commit such a heinous crime? On today's episode, we've come to answer those very questions. Welcome to Game Disdain, where the name of the game is that we complain about games. I'm your host, AJ, and please, come join me as we take a look at the second entry in the Silent Hill franchise. And also, Eddie has to be my favorite character in this game.
This town is full of monsters. How can you sit there and eat pizza?
The voice acting doesn't really make me feel creeped out so much as just bored.
Or maybe you think you can save me. Will you love me? Take care of me?
Anyway! What do you mean, anyway?
Angela is definitely my least favorite character out of the ones we have in the game.
But why?
That's all over now. I know the truth. Now it's time to end this.
Silent Hill 2's monsters, Silent Hill 2's gameplay with Silent Hill 2's soundtrack, the story of Silent Hill 2. Ultimately, Silent Hill 2 was the horror elements of Silent Hill 2. So I finally played Silent Hill 2. I thought it was overrated. Hold on, calm down. I thought some of it was good. About a third of it. Look, I'm sorry, but I tried so hard to enjoy this game. I really wanted to fall in love with it, just like I did with the first Silent Hill. But I just couldn't. I'm not even joking when I say that I repeatedly almost fell asleep playing this game multiple times. Until about 2/3 of the way in, it could barely keep my attention. The game just didn't feel like it was really going anywhere. I know that may sound absurd, especially with how revered this game is, but it just didn't click with me. Now, before you get out your torches and your pitchforks, just hear me out, okay? Just a heads up, I will be spoiling the entire game in this video. Now then, let's set the scene, shall we? The game starts you out as a man named James Sunderland entering Silent Hill, a mysterious town in which you are tasked to return to you and your wife's special place that was told to you in the letter that she wrote you. Yeah, your wife, Mary, wrote you a letter, but the catch is, she's been dead for 3 years, and you're here to investigate. While this introduction to the plot is iconic, it didn't interest me in the slightest, and it took me a while to figure out why. There isn't anything inherently wrong with it, it just didn't really click with me. Then I realized, oh wait a minute, I think I've seen this somewhere before, at least somewhat. Resident Evil 7 starts out very similarly. Wife goes missing for a period of time, and then you receive some sort of proof that she's still alive, and then you go and investigate to figure out what's going on. Now I know I can't blame Silent Hill 2 for that. 7 came out almost 15 years later. But I found that Resident Evil did this much better, and I experienced that game first, so unfortunately I don't have much praise for the beginning here. While 7 has a very interesting and creepy beginning area, Silent Hill 2 doesn't really show you anything is wrong for quite a while. 7's introduction has a couple of scares, and some unnerving set pieces, giving you the feeling that something is wrong without necessarily showing you any of the direct threats. Silent Hill 1 did something similar, although the direct threat did show up pretty quickly, even faster than Jack Baker's first appearance.
Welcome to the family, son.
Silent Hill 2, on the other hand, has you meander through a forest without anything creepy happening, aside from meeting Angela in the graveyard, which the voice acting doesn't really make me feel creeped out so much as just bored.
I guess I really don't care if it's dangerous or not.
But why?
I'm looking for someone.
Who is it?
Someone very important to me.
Now, I'm not saying something has to happen in the beginning. Something like that can work if you're not really expecting the horror after all. Doki Doki Literature Club and Gakugarashi both did that wonderfully. However, both of those are media that lure you in under false pretenses, before pulling the rug out from under you. Meanwhile, Silent Hill 2 is obviously a horror game from the start, which again is fine, but nothing the game does, either in gameplay or story, really makes me feel any sense of unease here. Anyway, you follow down the path after a trek through the forest in which you find a graveyard where you meet Angela. She seems incredibly incoherent when the two of you speak to each other. While I'm sure Angela was supposed to creep you out, for me it didn't really land due to the voice acting as mentioned prior. Oh, but don't worry though, I'll have more complaints for Angela as a character later on. Now, from this point onwards, I never felt that the story really went anywhere. The pacing just felt sort of off. Sure, James has his first enemy encounter here soon, and it's decent. But past that, the story really just twiddles its thumbs and feels almost aimless. You spend a little bit of time traveling through the town itself before ending up in Woodside Apartments. After a brief exploration, you then encounter Pyramid Head for the first time, in which I'm not going to describe this first encounter because both of YouTube guidelines and also it's just disgusting. I get that Pyramid Head is supposed to represent James himself and his twisted side as a means of foreshadowing, but it's so early that we don't even know James well enough for it to click together, so it ends up just feeling like shock value. I think it would have been better for Pyramid Head to be carrying the mannequin, kicking and fighting back, more so implying and showing that Pyramid Head is going to do something to them, still showing him as a bigger threat, while not necessarily jumping right into disgusting territory like that. I'm personally not fully comfortable with media covering that kind of subject matter so uncomfortably, but I do get what they were going for, and I think it would have been better if that kind of scene played later when we knew James better. Maybe piecing Pyramid Head closer to James, so that it would have a more uncomfortable impact as the player pieces together that there might be something a little bit more dark residing within James than we had initially thought. Moving on, it isn't much later when you meet Eddie in the apartment, who seems a bit off and in denial about the monster's body he just found. You then jump into Blue Creek Apartments, and it isn't much later before you meet Angela again, who seems to be attempting to try to free herself from this snooze fest of a nightmare, but in a way that, once again, just feels like shock value. You barely have just met, and now suddenly the game is just trying to throw the suicide angle at you. It just feels forced if you ask me. After this, the story slows down even further. You come across the child Laura, who you have seen for the briefest of moments when James was in the apartments, where she kicks a key out of your reach. However, I completely forgot about this until I was editing this script. Anyway, you find out she's here to visit Mary, which is kind of odd because she's, dead. Well, she runs off and you then meet Maria at the waterfront. She looks like Mary, but she sure as hell ain't Mary. She's way more risque and sexual towards James. The two of you team up for a bit, and here, the game just slows down to an absolute crawl. You've had all your character introductions now, and what do you spend the next majority of the game doing? Chasing this damn child around and escorting Maria, like here at the Brookhaven Hospital. Now, the escort sections themselves aren't too bad, but that's because the game is piss easy, at least on normal, barring the claustrophobic and irritating bosses, of course, which we will get to later on. Yeah, you spend a good chunk of the game following Laura around, and she's as annoying as you'd expect a child to be. She won't listen to you, acts like she hates you, and she even locks you up as a childish prank since she thinks you're a liar. Mind you, this almost gets you killed from the monster inside. Maybe it's just because I already hate being around annoying-ass kids as is, having worked a good amount of retail, but I just hated Laura as a character. Chasing after a kid is not how I'd like to spend my time. Seems James doesn't really want to either. But Maria insists that you run after the brat. Going through the hospital, you end up letting Maria rest in one of the rooms. After walking around by yourself, you find Laura once again, in which, After a bit of back and forth, she ends up calling you a liar, and then locking you in a room with a boss, which, as I mentioned a second ago, almost gets you killed, or in my case, it did, seeing as I didn't manage my items well enough up to this point, and was constantly low on health, leaving me one hit away from death. Fun. From this point on, we are entering much larger spoiler territory, so if you still want to experience the twists and turns of Silent Hill 2, then this is the point where you'll want to skip to later in the video. Now this does mean you'll miss a good chunk of the praise that I do have for this game, as well as the rest of the story, but I'd figured I'd warn you anyway, just in case. Here is either a quick timestamp, or, if I forget to edit one in, go ahead and use the chapters down at the bottom. If you're still around, I'm going to assume that you're ready to continue. So, let's proceed. Pyramid Head chases you through a hallway, and you're just about to escape when... Well, sorry, James. I'm sorry for your loss. Why don't you have a deep stroll around town to de-stress? After a brief exploration of the Silent Hill Historical Society, and I do mean brief, you find yourself in Toluca Prison, and this is when the game finally starts to get interesting. This area of the game is actually creepy and unnerving. To be fair, the prior main locations of the apartments and hospital didn't really resonate with me, which is due to expecting more interesting locations after playing through the first Silent Hill. The first game had a hospital, which I liked better, and the apartments left a lot to be desired, but Toluca Prison and onwards got me all excited. It felt like I was back in Silent Hill 1 again, nervous about what could be around any corner, and I was all for it. This is where things take a bit of a turn for me here, as I finally started enjoying this game. The story ramps up too, finding Eddie acting a bit deranged, having killed something, or someone, that came at him, essentially claiming it to be self-defense. Kinda odd when just a second ago he's talking about how easy it is to kill someone. He runs off, and it's up to you to explore the prison to proceed, and it just bears repeating that, man, this area is just so good. The atmosphere is just right. It's dark, creepy, dirty, and run down, all in a way that just feels perfect. I also have a huge soft spot for prisons, as I think exploring them in general is cool. I've even been to the prison in Ohio that was used for filming Shawshank Redemption, which exploring that was so much fun, and so Toluca hit all the right spots for me. The puzzle was cool, pretty unnerving to discover gallows in the middle of the courtyard. After exploring the prison, you jump down into some holes, digging yourself deeper and deeper into this creepy and decrepit location. Don't worry though, your incarceration has lifted, as it's time to enter the Labyrinth. I found the Labyrinth to be just about as good as the prison, almost Backrooms-esque, as it wasn't really clear where you actually were. It vaguely reminds me of an apartment or a hotel with its hallways, but yet also like an asylum with its rooms housing hospital equipment, a cell room, and even something that looks like a padded room. Aesthetically, for some reason, the Labyrinth reminds me of the maze towards the end of Danganronpa Ultra Despair Girls, specifically with its wall texture and overall maze-like design. Seeing as Danganronpa Ultra Despair Girls vaguely plays like a survival horror game, I'm wondering if it may have taken a small inspiration from Silent Hill 2. Regardless, I digress. The Labyrinth is where a lot of the interesting stuff in this game happens, and where the story goes full steam ahead. You first end up coming across Maria, in a jail cell. Oh, by the way, she's somehow still alive. I wonder, just how many times can a character survive a stab wound from Pyramid Head? James is obviously just as confused as I am. Maria mentions something about a videotape at the hotel, implying that she may actually be Mary, only to then remind you that she ain't your Mary. She comes on to James through the bars and tells him to come and get her out of there. So you leave the room to try to find a way to do just that. Not much later, you end up coming across Angela again, having last seen her back in the apartments towards the start of the game. She is being attacked by this weird wide creature called an Abstract Daddy, and you gain some telling information on her past experiences with her father, as well as the abuse she endured, which, like with the Pyramid Head situation back towards the start of the game, I really don't want to talk about any of it in too much detail. After killing the monster, she ends up treating James coldly, re-experiencing her trauma, and ultimately James has no choice but to leave her be. Angela is definitely my least favorite character out of the ones we have in the game. I'd save this discussion for her final appearance, but my main issue stems with her lack of appearance in the game. She's the first character you meet, and while most of the characters barring Maria don't have many appearances, Angela's feels the most disjointed. You meet her, and then you find her in the apartments about to drive a knife through her chest, and then you don't see her at all until this moment, which is a very large chunk of the game with her absent. Then she only has one more appearance, in the last area of the game, which we will get to. But at least Eddie had a brief appearance in the bowling alley right before the hospital. I think Angela just having one more appearance, maybe even in that hospital, would have helped her feel more involved with the story as a whole and not feel so disjointed. On top of all of that, though, she's really hard to understand, and she stays hard to understand throughout the entire game. It always feels like she's talking past James, not really acknowledging his interactions with her, barring this specific appearance. She just feels off. And sure, that may have been what they were trying to go with for her character, but I don't know. When I first encountered her, I thought she was going to become some sort of threat by the end of the game, with that uncanniness of how she spoke. But that never happens, which is fine on paper, but it felt like they were trying to both have her creep the player out, while also trying to have the player sympathize with her, which again is fine, but not when every interaction she has with James is unclear and confusing. She never felt like she belonged in the game. And with her specific trauma as well, it just feels so backwards to have her be the hardest to understand. Like, I get that truly understanding that type of trauma isn't really feasible unless you've been through it, but if you're going to make a character with that type of trauma, wouldn't you at the very least not want to make it any harder to do so? I just can't tell what the writers were going for with her. Moving away from Angela for now, the rest of the labyrinth is a joy. The puzzles in this area were quite fun, and every time I had to go down into the underground portions, I actually felt afraid and uncomfortable, the claustrophobic space definitely making me feel a sense of danger. Upon finally making it back to the cell through another door, there waits Maria, lying in a pool of her own blood on the bed, no longer amongst the living. Well, sorry, James. I'm sorry for your loss. Might as well get out of here then. Towards the end of the labyrinth, you come across a graveyard. There are 3 graves that have been dug up, each of the headstones reading off a different name, those names being Eddie, Angela, and James, respectively. James's grave is the deepest, and quite deep at that. You end up having to jump through your own grave to progress. I guess that bit about digging yourself deeper really lost all subtlety now, huh? You are now in a lovely meat freezer, where you come across Eddie once more. He has fully lost it, seeing James as no different than the bullies that used to treat him like shit. You fight Eddie briefly before he flees into another room. From there, he does the whole "you and I are the same" line before continuing the fight. I'll elaborate a little bit more in the gameplay section, but I really enjoyed this boss fight. And also, Eddie has to be my favorite character in this game. I found his voice delivery to be some of the better work between the cast.
It doesn't matter if you're smart, dumb, ugly, pretty. It's all the same once you're dead.
And I also felt that his character was the most sensible, as in, his character felt consistent and made sense as he derailed into losing it until finally attacking James, where characters like Angela, and even James himself, felt like they either lacked substance or were confusingly written. You kill Eddie in self-defense and just, wow. Maybe you two really are alike. Leaving the meat freezer, you end up directly behind the Historical Society, right by the lake. You row yourself toward the light, and you have finally arrived at the Lakeview Hotel. The same hotel you and Mary stayed at so long ago. That's right, you're finally at that special place that Mary mentioned in her letter. We are in the home stretch, as Lakeview is the final major location in the game, and man, does it get good from here. I loved this last part of the game, barring some frustrations. I found Lakeview to be incredibly unnerving and uncomfortable. The rundown hotel feeling drab while still being interesting, a great contrast from the apartments at the start of the game. It feels like a proper liminal space to me. Like, while walking through the hotel, it really felt like people used to stay here. You enter the restaurant and come across...
Did I scare you?
Yeah, the brat got a good scare out of me on that one. She actually has a proper conversation with James, and it turns out Mary wrote Laura a letter that Laura lets James read. And wow, it's pretty sad. Turns out while Mary was in the hospital, she and Laura got pretty close. Seems like Laura was something of a daughter to Mary, and Mary was fully prepared to adopt her if things got better. She tells Laura in the letter that James is not so bad, which only hints further to James's darker side. After reading the letter, Laura runs off, apparently having lost another letter from Mary, and now we're back to chasing the brat. At least this time we have a proper reason to. You run into two abstract daddies out in the hall, and while this isn't relevant to the story, I just wanted to mention it here because they've turned a boss into a normal enemy, which, once we get to talking about the game's enemies, you're going to see why this bothers me so much. So just pin it until we get there. Now you have some time to freely explore the hotel and solve some puzzles, and these puzzles are pretty good too. You eventually come across an elevator with a weight limit, and you end up having to dump all of your items into a locker, leaving yourself defenseless. Down this elevator, you eventually come across the videotape Maria had mentioned back in the labyrinth. Knowing now what's on that tape, I'm wondering if this was some sort of metaphor of some kind. James removing his protection like he's opening himself up to the truth that he's been denying himself the whole time. Getting back up the elevator and grabbing your stuff leads to you solving some more puzzles. Now it's finally time for you to head over to room 312, the room you and Mary stayed at back when you were in Silent Hill so long ago. Here you place the videotape you found into the VCR, and the truth is finally revealed. Turns out James was the one that killed Mary this whole time. Well, sorry James. I'm sorry for your loss. Laura rushes in and James tells her the truth. Understandably upset, she leaves, and poor James seems utterly defeated. The radio goes off, however, and Mary's voice tells James to come and find her. Leaving the room, the hotel is seemingly soaked. You have now entered the nightmare or hellish version of the hotel. After making your way through this version of the hotel, you come across Angela one more time. Angela confuses you for her mother somehow, but then she does realize that it's you. She thanks you for saving her and then says she wishes you hadn't, that she deserved to die and all that. She then asks for the knife back, which James refuses. Accusing James of saving it for himself, James insists that he'd never kill himself. I wonder. Oh, did I forget to mention that the stairway's on fire? She says some cryptic shit about this always looking that way for her, and she leaves. Alright then. That was the end of Angela's character. That's it. That's all we get. Once you make it to the lobby, you find Maria once more, held up by two pyramid heads. James tries to get them to stop, but they still stab a spear straight through Maria. I wonder, just how many times can a character survive a stab wound from Pyramid Head? Huh, guess it's just once. Oh, and... Well, sorry, James. I'm sorry for your loss. Have I run this joke into the ground yet? James then says some really unfitting badass one-liners.
But that's all over now. I know the truth. Now it's time to end this.
And then you take on the two pyramid heads at once in a boss fight. Beating the two pyramid heads causes them to turn their spears upon themselves, impaling themselves on their own weapon. James leaves into a long hallway, only to listen to a wonderful recording of Mary blowing up at James, only to then get sad when he leaves. Leaving the hallway, you come across a platform where you fight the final boss, a weird, twisted version of Mary and Maria. After killing the final boss, you get another cutscene where Mary and James discuss James murdering her. From there, she tells you to go on with your life, and then finally, from there, this is where you end up getting one of 4 of the main endings, or 2 joke endings. I personally achieved the in-water ending, where James feels so much guilt that he ends up driving himself into Toluca Lake with Mary's body in the car, ultimately killing himself in the end. And that was Silent Hill 2's story for me. In the end, James couldn't move on and overcome his grief, instead being fully consumed by it. I really liked this last third of the game, if you couldn't tell, which, if you're coming from skipping the major spoilers, you probably can't. While the last bit was great, it was incredibly rough getting to this point. I know with the way that I described it, beat for beat, it probably sounds like it was way more interesting, like things were always happening, but I was only discussing story points, and mainly cutscenes at that. That was without mentioning every bit of gameplay that happened in between. You'd have a cutscene and then spend a decent chunk of time before getting another, if you got one at all, and so the story actually progressed at a pretty slow pace. There was just so little story compared to the 12 hours that I spent playing. The main issue for me was it felt like we were thrown into meeting these characters and then nothing's really done with them throughout the entire game. And then suddenly, it's over. The characters have their endings and we have really nothing to show in between. I feel if we would have just had a few more encounters with these characters, preferably in the middle of the game, that the story wouldn't have ended up feeling so poorly paced. Overall, I think the story is too mixed for me to really want to go back and get any of the other endings, so we won't be covering those here, as I don't really think the ending matters in this instance anyway. I did read up on them, and they all seem fine and enjoyable, but my main issue with the game is that it started and stayed boring for as long as it did. So it would seem that the story of James Sunderland took its time getting off of the ground. While it did eventually find its footing, by the time that it did, plenty of issues had already piled up. While some of the issues would be solved with genuinely interesting plot points and memorable twists, many of the issues would persist, ultimately hurting it in the end. And unfortunately, it would seem that the story of Silent Hill 2 isn't the only one that would suffer in that very same regard. Now, I can handle a struggling story in a game. After all, many would claim that the gameplay comes first before a game's story, right? Plus, I found that while the first game didn't really have a good story, I loved the gameplay. Well, sorry to say that Silent Hill 2 doesn't really hold up in that regard either. Now, this is a horror game. I have seen this game heralded as the Magnum Opus of horror, even by IGN, which, as of the end of August, is still rated by them as the best horror game of all time. This sits next to many of the Resident Evil games, including 7, as well as the first Silent Hill, both of which I find to be way scarier than Silent Hill 2. So I find it pretty funny that the gameplay fails to land any sense of horror or fear. Now this I have a bone to pick with. See, when I played the original Silent Hill, the horror kept me hooked, and it was one of the only games that was actually able to scare me. So when I played Silent Hill 2, thinking that I would get to go through that all over again, I was thoroughly disappointed. So, during this segment of the video, I will be leveraging a lot of comparisons to this game's predecessor. Now then, where do I even start? How about with the game's atmosphere? Several of the game's locations felt either mediocre or entirely lacking until later in the game. Again, while the introduction may be iconic, I found that it didn't instill a sense of fear or even discomfort in me at all. Be it the forest or the graveyard in Angela's introduction, I just found myself bored. The apartments I found to be very uninteresting, but at the very least fine for a starting dungeon. They were drab, but never really creeped me out. Woodside specifically didn't interest me at all. Blue Creek was definitely creepier, but when compared to searching the elementary school of the first game, the apartments left no impact and felt fairly forgettable and inoffensive. Now, Brookhaven Hospital got me excited at first, but I was thoroughly disappointed, as it and its nightmare variant felt boring compared to the really gross and uncomfortable Nightmare Hospital of the first game, with its brown and red, well, everything. Not only that, but this is the second hospital. We've done this before, and it wasn't even as creepy as the first one. And while this area is again fine, it definitely could have been executed much better, and isn't really helping the atmosphere problem. The fun but brief historical society was actually creepy, and I really enjoyed breaking out of the well. It definitely got the ball rolling on making Silent Hill 2 a bit more interesting. However, it was a little bit too short for my liking. Now, the prison I absolutely adored. I know I talked a lot about Toluca during the story segment, but I feel like it wouldn't be fair to leave it out here. The prison was honestly exactly what I wanted from Silent Hill 2. It really did feel like a location that could have been back in the first game, hitting all the right spots for me like other locations did back in that game. Honestly, a new enemy type here is probably the only thing it's missing. I mentioned it before, but I really do love prisons, so it definitely hit my biases a bit, as I've always found the aesthetics and settings of prisons to be really enjoyable. I also loved jumping through hole after hole, going deeper and deeper. It felt like a very uncomfortable yet fun set piece. Also, is it just me, or did the rooms get much darker visibility-wise? It actually felt like I was navigating through darkness, whereas the prior locations in the game felt much better lit. Though I admit that I may be misremembering here. If not, though, then it definitely helped the atmosphere. The gallows puzzle was a nice surprise. Just the aesthetic of finding it in the middle of the courtyard felt ominous and foreboding. I also just love the aesthetic of nooses in media, especially horror, as weird as that may sound. They've always just creeped me out and made me feel really uncomfortable, so they've really hit the nail on the head for me here. Honestly, I'd give the prison a 9 out of 10, genuinely. It's earned high praises from me. The labyrinth was a great follow-up too. I loved the puzzle of rotating the room like a goddamn Rubik's Cube. That was a lot of fun. The liminal space of the labyrinth also hit that lovely spot in my brain solely reserved for liminal spaces that we all seem to have nowadays. That hanged convict puzzle was also a fun and creative one, while hitting that spot of the noose aesthetic that we talked about prior. Some of the rooms also made it feel like an asylum, as I had mentioned before, which asylums are always fun in horror. Honestly, if we had had an asylum for a location in this game, I think that would have been absolutely perfect. Then, the underground segments being so claustrophobic made it a relief when I had to resurface, which, having that flow of having to go down, feeling the tension, only to then come back up to have some reprieve, even if not much, is exactly what horror games should be doing. The graveyard with the 3 characters' graves was startling, and it helped build you up for my favorite boss fight. The meat freezer setting for that boss fight was just really gross in all the right ways, while still being fully functional for cover, so the fight itself was a perfect finale for the labyrinth, leaving it as a very memorable location. The brief Toluca Lake segment was a nice set piece to build up the final area of the game, but it was ultimately pretty empty, so I have mixed feelings on it. Now, the final area. Lakeview Hotel. What a wonderful location. It looked like a genuinely nice hotel. One that felt like a real place that real people used to reside in. The part where you had to disarm yourself, leaving yourself so vulnerable, is the perfect thing to do this late into the game, especially when you've probably made yourself pretty sustainable and surviving isn't as much of a concern in this survival horror game. The Nightmare Hotel was another creepy place to explore, especially with those teleporting rooms. Now, I want to briefly talk about the whole nightmare aspect. In the first game, the nightmare segments were a huge aspect of that game, twisting the world and adding an extra layer of danger, as every time it would happen, the drastic changes in aesthetic would make you feel more and more unsafe. Unfortunately, Silent Hill 2 barely utilizes this. While the hotel's nightmare segment is good, the hospital sucked and didn't really feel that drastic of a change. And then the apartments didn't even have it. Though I do think that Blue Creek was intended to be the nightmare version of Woodside, as the changes between the two are quite drastic. But the nightmare segments were just kind of there, almost feeling like an afterthought, not really influencing the game much, which was pretty disappointing, as I really loved the nightmare sections of the first game. The final boss location at least felt dangerous, being a much more industrial area compared to the rest of the game, so I liked the overall vibe of that. Now, while I have praised the atmosphere a lot, two of the major locations in the game lacked the proper atmosphere to really scare me at all. And I did leave out one major portion of the game out this entire time, because it's the part that bothers me the most. Can you take a guess at what area of the game bothered me most? Seriously, take a guess. What area did I leave out? The whole goddamn town of Silent Hill itself. You spend a good chunk of your time here and it sucks, man. Whenever you hear the title Silent Hill, what's one of the first things you think of? The fog, right? Well, the fog in this game is absolutely pathetic. It looks more like a constant smokescreen rather than fog. Yet the first game's fog looked perfect. Here, let me throw up a comparison image for you. Which one looks better to you? The shitty-ass gray smokescreen, or the sublime, dense, and almost completely blinding white haze of the first game? The fog in Silent Hill 2 doesn't really do a good job at hiding anything from you. Like, it kind of does, but not nearly as well as the first games. What doesn't help is the further render distance that lets you see shit from a mile away. In the first Silent Hill, you can't see anything until it's damn near right on top of you. In Silent Hill 2, the radio almost doesn't even feel necessary, because you're going to see most enemies before you even hear them. Whereas in the first game, the radio gave you a general idea of where enemies were, without giving away their exact location, which left you feeling unsafe because anything could jump out of that fog at any time. I think most of the horror community seems to respect fog to a certain extent, recognizing its importance when it's utilized effectively, but Silent Hill 2 shits all over it. I love fog so much in other horror media. Silent Hill 1, Nacht der Untoten, and Call of Duty World at War, and even in movies like The Mist, fog was utilized to obscure threats, which is why I find Silent Hill 2's fog to be so disappointing. It doesn't obscure jack shit. It's that fear of the unknown, you know? So, overall, the scary atmosphere didn't really land. In fact, the game's atmosphere didn't really make me feel anything at all, let alone fear. And for a horror game, that's a pretty huge problem. Fog can be an incredible tool for horror, obscuring threats where you can't really make out where or what a threat is until it's effectively too late. It's what made things like Call of Duty Zombies so effective in the beginning, at least in terms of horror. This looming threat inching closer from the fog. The same can be said about darkness. What you can see in the light, not scary. But when you think you're alone, you never know what's going to step out from behind the shadows. Effective creepy settings make taking another step into the next room an uncomfortable challenge. When the setting feels gross, like when the walls are covered in grime or gore, it feels all the more unsafe, pushing you to stay in the middle of, say, a hallway where something can step out from the darkness. While some parts of the game had an effective atmosphere, a large portion did not, and the fear of the unknown being almost entirely absent only further drags down the elements of horror present. Once again, however, we aren't done, as there are still more issues to be had with both the gameplay and the horror elements of Silent Hill 2. Speaking of fear of the unknown, the enemies in this game left a lot to be desired. How many enemy types do you think there are in Silent Hill 2? Come on, take a guess. I'm patient, I promise. 4! A measly 4 enemies! 5 if you count the Abstract Daddy, which was just a boss before it became a common enemy later. Let's just go through them one by one, shall we? You've got the iconic nurse, which is a stumbling, skinny enemy that makes its way towards you slowly before attacking you. You've got the mannequin, a stumbling, skinny enemy that makes its way towards you slowly before attacking you. You've got the Mandarin, which barely shows up in the game, appearing under metal grates and attacking you, normally when you're not moving. It's barely a threat. And then finally, you have the most important common enemy, the lying figure, which is a stumbling, skinny enemy that makes its way towards you slowly before attacking you. See the issue? The main common enemies in this game damn near all act the same. They're pretty much just reskins of each other. I'll give the lying figures credit. They can hit you from a small distance, and when they get knocked on the ground, they become this aggressive crawler that moves incredibly fast, making them pretty hard to hit. But that's the first enemy that you see in the game. They're the only proper enemy with any variety that actually does something, but they are littered all over the game to the point where they overstay their welcome. The game just becomes this point of hearing your radio and going, "Oh, well, I hope it isn't another lying figure," because they waste your resources the most, and then you'll just blaze past the other enemy types and be happy that it isn't a lying figure. Now, yes, I know the Mandarins exist, but I only ever got hit by them once during my entire playthrough. They're so easy to avoid that they felt more like those Koopas in castle levels climbing fences in the background, rather than an actual enemy I had to deal with, so I'm not really counting them. They were barely a threat. At least the Abstract Daddies add some variety in enemy type, but it's so late in the game that you've already seen the 4 enemies so much that they've overstayed their welcome. So by the time that the Abstract Daddies appear, it's so brief that it doesn't really refresh the experience enough. Compare that to the first Silent Hill and you have, and bear with me here, the Grey Children, Air Screamers, Groaners, Puppet Doctors, Puppet Nurses, Creepers, Larval Stalkers, Rompers, Night Flutters, Wormheads, Hang Scratchers, and finally Stalkers, for a final total of 12 enemies. 12 enemies, and that's not even counting bosses. If you look up Silent Hill enemies, for the first game, the wiki shows the list I just gave you. For the second game, the wiki literally has to include bosses just to have a decent list, while Silent Hill 1 has its own section dedicated to bosses. And they aren't just a bunch of reskins either. There are some, sure, but most of them actually function differently from each other. For comparison's sake, we'll only look at a few. You have the Groaners, dog-like flesh creatures that are, well, dogs basically. They run at you and try to bite you. They're pretty easy to avoid and handle, and are incredibly simple, but they make for a good early game threat, looking incredibly gross and uncomfortable, making you want to keep your distance. The Air Screamer, a wing terror that tends to attack you from the fog or off screen. They are much more annoying of a threat than the Groaners, but you can hear their wings flapping from a good distance before they attack you. The last ones we will look at are the Grey Children. Children-sized creepy fuckers with a knife that attack your ankles, holding you in place. These ones always stood out to me when I played Silent Hill. I just hate childlike monsters in horror. They creep the fuck out of me. So, with just 3 enemies from the first game, they already have a huge variety in comparison. And those are just early game enemies, from the town and the school, the first major location in the game. I easily could go on, but we'd be here all day, and this video is already getting pretty long. When I played the original Silent Hill, what really kept me engaged was the new enemies. It felt like no matter how good I got at the game, I was never safe, because I'd come across something else that would throw me off my guard. I never really had the chance to get used to a new enemy because before I did, something else would be my new threat. So, when I started Silent Hill 2, I was really looking forward to more of that. And when I first encountered the lying figure, I won't lie, I was disappointed. But I was like, nah, it's fine. It's just an early game enemy. Surely the enemies will hold my interest later. And then it never happened. And this is what really brought me to make this video. As stupid as it sounds, I really loved the enemies of the first game. Almost every time I would encounter a new enemy and legitimately react with a, "What the fuck is that?" And that's exactly what I want from horror. I am incredibly desensitized to things, especially in horror. Not much really bothers me in horror anymore. But the first game did, and so I was expecting a lot more. The monsters never really gave me a moment like that, and I'm just so disappointed, man. I've even heard arguments online that Silent Hill 2 isn't about the horror, which it's like, what the hell is it even supposed to be then? A survival horror game, supposedly the magnum opus of the genre, isn't supposed to be about horror? What? Moving on, I'll briefly touch on the bosses, simply because they do suffer from a lot of the same issues. Where the first game's bosses all felt unique and interesting, the sequel here was just a mixed bag. Not as bad as the monsters for sure, but still lacking. Most of the things really are just you in a tight room shooting a thing until it dies, barring Eddie and the final boss, although even they fall into the same pitfalls, they just do a bit more than that. While yes, you could technically argue any boss is just hitting a thing till it dies, I definitely felt like the game just wanted to throw me in a tight room with an annoying thing as just some form of challenge. The first game's bosses had more space to maneuver, and at least felt like they required some timing and strategy to beat them, and felt varied enough, while Silent Hill 2's bosses are either really irritating or just decent. I will say though, Silent Hill 2's bosses aren't as bad as the monster problem, so that's why I'm not making a big deal out of it here. In the horror genre, one would want the threats of the media in question to be just that, a threat. While the first Silent Hill had a range of monsters that were all different, both physically and mechanically, keeping the player on their toes while tapping into that fear of the unknown, Silent Hill 2's monsters were underwhelming, with a lot left to be desired. What makes horror work is the element of surprise. If you were to rewatch a horror movie or replay a horror game, it would immediately be less scary due to already knowing the twists, turns, and scares coming ahead. Good horror is like lightning in a bottle. You only get one good shot at making it work. Silent Hill 2 missed that shot entirely, failing to capture any real sense of horror by failing to surprise the player with new threats. So, what about the rest of the gameplay? Well, there really isn't too much to say. I did really enjoy most of the puzzles, even in the apartments and hospital looking back, even if I didn't enjoy those areas themselves. Item distribution seems to be a bit better than the first game, but toward the end of the game it still piles on a lot of healing and ammo on you like crazy, at least on normal. I did actually struggle with an uphill battle from early to mid-game about keeping my health up, though. At about the time that I'd restore my health and run out of healing items, I'd drop back to low, which is definitely why I got the in-water ending. Weapon progression is pretty much the same as Silent Hill 1 as well. For guns, you gain a pistol, shotgun, and a rifle, exactly like the first game, while for melee weapons, you gain a wooden plank as your weaker weapon in place of the knife, and a pipe for your stronger weapon, again, just like the first game. Later, you do get Pyramid Head's Great Knife, which does a lot of damage, but you can barely walk with it at all. Now, I was unfortunate enough to miss the pipe, so most of my melee encounters ended up looking like this. I also missed the rifle in the first Silent Hill, so I seem to have a small habit of forgetting a weapon each playthrough. There is also a chainsaw you can get on subsequent playthroughs that's pretty powerful. Not too different from the first game there. What about the controls? Well, there isn't much to say there. The game is played using tank controls, rotating the camera and then moving forward, rather than just moving your character around freely in any direction. The actual button layout seems to be the exact same as the first game as well, holding the right trigger to ready your weapon, and then using the action button to attack, strafing with R1 and L1 and so on, so no real issues there. I did feel like it was a little clunkier for me, but I played the Restless Dreams version of the game on the OG Xbox, which does have some really weird button placements due to the lack of bumpers on the controller. That has the strafing placed on the X and B buttons, while sprinting and walking are a toggle via the black button, rather than just holding a button, which would have been X had the controller actually had bumpers. In the end, though, these differences in controls didn't really cause me any serious issues. Oh, but navigating the map was really annoying. It wasn't really clear to me which direction I'd press would lead to which part of the map. But I think that was also an issue in the first game, too. It's funny. Towards the end of the script is where I'm talking about the controls, rather than at the start where you would expect. I also find it interesting that about the time the story gets good, the gameplay and the horror elements do as well. I definitely feel like it can't just be a coincidence. I can't really explain why. Perhaps they wrote out the ending first and then designed the later locations around that? I'm not really sure. Just a feeling, really. Anyways, that's really all I have to say about the gameplay. Overall, Silent Hill 2's gameplay was lacking the horror elements that really defines the survival horror genre. Just like with the story, while it improved towards the latter third of the game, many of its prior issues still persisted. For a game heralded as the best horror game of all time, its major absence of effective horror elements put into question its success as an actual survival horror experience. Now, this video has been quite negative, but there is one thing that I can universally praise this game for, and that's the music. Akira Yamaoka returns, but rather than composing a soundtrack that consists mostly of either creepy ambience tracks or downright terrifying industrial-esque tracks, Yamaoka composes a range of tracks. Many of which are still creepy or terrifying, but most of them are either beautiful masterpieces or absolute bangers, all of which are also filled with just so much emotion. As I've been finishing up writing this script, I've been listening to the OST on YouTube, and everything I'm hearing is an absolute joy. There were many points during Silent Hill 2 where I just stopped and listened, soaking in the track that was playing in the background. Some of my favorites include Promise Reprise, which is the track that plays during your second encounter with Angela, when she has the knife. Fermata and Mystic Air, which plays when James gets to Maria's cell in the labyrinth. Forest, which plays during Angela's introduction. Theme of Laura reprise, which plays during the final Angela cutscene, and Love Song, a track that plays at the end of Maria's Born from a Wish side story. While I don't like Angela as a character, she definitely got some of the best tracks in the game. I also love how, depending on the different ending that you get in the game, you get a different end credits song. It's a nice touch that helps reflect the emotions of the respective ending. The music in Silent Hill 2 gets a 10 out of 10 from me. It appears that one saving grace of Silent Hill 2 would be its music, untouched by many of the flaws that persisted throughout the game. Music is an effective tool that can be used to influence a player's emotions, which may help alleviate or distract a player from many of a game's flaws. The same tool can be used to strengthen already powerful moments. Silent Hill 2's soundtrack managed to do both, having a mixture of effective horror ambience that can at least serve to alarm the player, keeping them wary, as well as having masterful pieces to accompany and amplify emotional scenes. It would be hard to argue against that the music had a massive impact on those who experienced Silent Hill 2, and that is one of the few positives the game can lay claim to. In conclusion, Silent Hill 2 was a mostly boring experience that only got good 66% of the way in. So you're probably wondering, what's the point? Why does it matter? Can't you just let the people enjoy the game they love? And the point is this: I love a game too. I sat down and played Silent Hill 1 in March of 2023. And while I had piddled around with the first bit of the game, that was through emulation. For context, I was always drawn to Silent Hill, it being the supposed origin of video game horror next to Resident Evil. The footage I saw of it reached deep into my brain, and I just knew I had to play it, and that I would most likely like it. I didn't really have any consoles with Silent Hill games on them when I first got interested in the franchise, barring the Wii, which I didn't even learn until later that Shattered Memories existed and was even playable on it. So I emulated it my first go-around. I couldn't stand the tank controls at the time. I eventually got a PS3 Super Slim from a classmate in high school, and once I learned how to mod that with PS3 Hen, the first game I loaded up on it was Silent Hill 1. Now, I know you were able to buy it digitally on the PS3 store at the time, but around then I was really starting to push to buy only physical games, seeing as I was becoming a preservation nut and wanted true ownership over my games. So I figured if I was going to buy Silent Hill 1 in any capacity, I might as well go physical. Maybe some minor annoyances here and there. I do remember wondering why there's no walk button, only just now having found out about the black button being the toggle, but that's about it, really. So, emulating it for the time being, I messed around a bit at the start and really began enjoying the game. But then I got to, I want to say about the house very early on in the game at the latest, and realized that I really liked the game. So much that I decided that I would wait until I had a proper, original hardware physical copy. Long story short, I got into game collecting after getting a job, and I eventually ended up buying a PS1. Later down the line, I forked over the $90 for a physical copy, which was just the case and disc, no manual or insert, at a semi-local game store, seeing as, during my 2 years of collecting, I had never once seen the game in person, so it was the perfect opportunity to snag it. Soon after that, because I had to have my games complete in box, I ordered a perfect condition case and manual for another $140. Finally, that brings us to March of last year, where I pushed myself to break through my backlog and get through some of my collection, which is where I finally played Silent Hill 1 in full. Even this late into my life, I found a game that actually managed to scare me, and it was thrilling. I truly adored Silent Hill 1, and I still do. It's one of my favorite games of all time. So please understand, while I'm tearing its sequel to shreds, it's truly coming out of a place of love. The combination of loving the first game as much as I do, and the amount of overhype I've heard from both people online and even people I knew personally, put this massive expectation on its sequel to blow me away, and it just didn't do that, and I'm really disappointed. And it makes me so angry because whenever I hear discussion about Silent Hill, it's almost always either talking about how bad most of the other games are, or how Silent Hill 2 is this magnum opus of horror, and it's incredibly frustrating. It seems like the game that started it all doesn't really ever get the recognition it deserves, while its younger brother gets all the recognition in the world. Please understand, I don't hate Silent Hill 2 in and of itself. It's more so that I hate the overwhelming praise for it that I hear. Don't get me wrong, it's okay to like or even love a game. If it resonated with you, I don't want to take that away from you. And I even tried to give the game a chance. Normally, if we're being honest, if a game couldn't hold my attention for the first 3 or 4 hours, I would have written it off as not that great and completely moved on with my life. But due to the praise, I continued to give the game more and more chances, and eventually, yeah, I struck something worthwhile. I loved the last third. It had some wonderful stuff there. For a moment, it brought me back to what I loved. But should it have taken 9 hours? 9 hours out of 12? Would you sit through 9 hours of something just to get to the good 3 hours? Scale that even higher and it makes it look a whole lot worse. 18 hours out of 24, perhaps? I won't push that any further, but after seeing all of the praise 2 gets compared to the first game, I just get so frustrated, and can you really blame me? When I have that much history with Silent Hill? I'm talking years, by the way. From 2016, where it first caught my attention, to 2023, where I beat it, that's my start and initial finish with the first game. 7 years. And now, I don't even know if I like Silent Hill as a franchise. Seeing as I've only played the first 2 and I didn't really like the second one, I currently only like half the franchise. Not only that, but anything past 4 is apparently dog shit as well. Hell, I've even heard that 3 and 4 are bad according to some Silent Hill fans. What the hell does that make this franchise? But I will eventually visit those games later and find out for myself. And hey, maybe in the future I'll revisit Silent Hill 2 at some point, even if it is just to play through Maria's side story, seeing as currently I don't have much of an interest in it. I'll definitely be revisiting the first Silent Hill to give it the proper review it deserves rather than just having it be an arsenal of talking points against its sequel. It's the least I could do for a game that means so much to me. That much I can promise. Now then, let's wrap this up, shall we? Ultimately, Silent Hill 2 was a mixed bag. While its story elements took its time getting off of the ground, the gameplay struggled right along with it. Normally, one could overlook one side of the coin, as long as the other can at least keep the player's attention. However, many of its strongest moments arrive too late, with most of the game lacking anything worthwhile to push the player to getting there in the first place. Even as a survival horror experience, the game fails, not even able to surpass its predecessor, which ran on weaker and less capable hardware. With the sequel's atmosphere not striking the proper chord, nor having enough enemy variety, the horror elements seem to have fallen to the wayside. All that remains is an undercooked experience. This hasn't seemed to affect the fame or glory it has gathered over the years, however, even as many other older games have received second looks from the public eye, recognizing them as dated or flawed. It seems that Silent Hill 2 has become an icon for horror, as well as for Silent Hill as a franchise, with the game even receiving a remake just recently. Meanwhile, the first Silent Hill is almost entirely ignored, even by its own parent company, having not received a remake or re-release while being both older and harder to obtain. Maybe after the release of the remake, the modern sphere of gaming may come to recognize that Silent Hill 2 isn't the horror icon they remember. Perhaps the remake has fixed many of the issues that plagued the game from start to finish. Only time will tell what the general public's perception of Silent Hill 2 will become. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Game Disdain. I look forward to seeing you again on the next one. Until then, I bid you all a good night.